Good evening. I'm Rachel Flohr, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this program online, as well as all of you who are here in person with us tonight. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We thank you all who are here in person for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or your comments on our YouTube page during the program. When the Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Well, we typically plan our post-midterm forum. We generally expect the outcomes to be decided. Such is not the case tonight, of course, which makes us even more grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore some of the key issues raised by these consequential midterm elections with our distinguished guests. I am now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to extend a warm welcome back to the library to Dan Balz, Chief Correspondent at the Washington Post. He joined the paper in 1978 and has been involved in the Post's political coverage as an award-winning reporter or editor throughout his career. He is the author of several books, including 2 bestsellers. He is a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and is a frequent guest on the Sunday morning talk shows and other public affairs programs. I'm also delighted to welcome E.J. Dionne back to the library. He writes about politics in a twice-weekly column for the Washington Post. He is also a government professor at the Georgetown University, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute, and a frequent commentator on politics for National Public Radio and MSNBC. The author of many books and editor of many more, he most recently co-authored 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. I'm very pleased to extend a warm welcome back to the library to Errin Haines. She is editor-at-large at the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. An award-winning journalist with nearly 2 decades of experience, she was previously national writer on race for the Associated Press. She's also worked at the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. I'm also delighted to welcome Kimberly Atkins Stohr back to the library. A senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe Opinion, she is also the inaugural columnist for the Emancipator, a joint independent anti-race multimedia project from Globe Opinion and Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, and author of its newsletter, Unbound. She is also an MSNBC contributor and co-host of the Politican podcast, Sisters-in-Law. And I am so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening, Larry Tye, back to the library. He's a New York Times bestselling author whose most recent book is Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. The author of 7 other books, he also runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, which helps the media do a better job reporting on critical issues like public health, mental health, and high-tech medicine by training a dozen medical journalists a year from newspapers, radio stations, and TV outlets nationwide. From 1986 to 2001, Tye was an award-winning reporter at the Boston Globe. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Great. So I'd like to just start by saying that we have a panel here not just of 4 of the smartest people in the world to discuss what just happened in the midterms, but the 4 tiredest people in America. And the idea that they came all this way tonight is a sign of how important the library is and how convincing Liz is in bringing in her speakers. And so I'm delighted that they're all here with us. And Dan, I'd like to start with you. You've been covering midterm elections, we just decided, since 1978. So you get how the press creates an intuition and then the next day changes that based on what's happened. And I would like to pose a question to you that is inspired by a guy named John Della Volpe, who is head of polling at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And he said that there were essentially 2 waves that happened on Tuesday. One was among voters over 40, the red wave. And those voters, if they were the only ones who voted, would have given us the predicted red wave across the country. And the other was the blue wall that was erected among voters under 40 that basically saved the Democrats' lunch. And as he said it, it was saving their lunch for the 3rd time in a row, the 3rd election in a row. And I want to know, is the real story of the midterms an age-related story, and does it bode well for Democrats, given this rising demographic?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank the library for assembling this panel. It's always a delight to be back here. You know, John is a friend, and I think that observation is smart, and it is part of the story of this election, but it's not the only part of the story. As I look at this election outcome, and again, we don't quite know what the ultimate outcome is, but we have a pretty good idea that it is not the outcome that the Republicans anticipated, or even many Democrats anticipated. And the context that I have put it in, as I've thought about it over the last few days, is that Donald Trump has created an energized electorate. He's created an energized electorate on the right, as we know, and also on the left. And for the last 3 elections, 2018, 2020, and now 2022, that electorate showed up in force. And it is pretty well balanced. And as a result of that, as a result of kind of the general mix of issues, we had the outcome that we had, which is that Democrats did much better than anybody anticipated. And as President Biden said, the best midterm for a Democratic president, going back to John Kennedy in 1962. So there's no question that young voters were crucial to the Democrats' hopes, and they turned out in significant numbers, which was the real question heading in, because in normal midterms they don't. But I think that the combination of the Trump factor, which I think has now extended to the brand of the Republican Party, and the abortion issue, made it more likely that they were going to turn out, and they did.
Great. So, Kimberly, I started this afternoon by listening to you doing smart commentary on the radio, and I'm delighted to be sitting next to you now. Today's banner headline in the New York Times celebrated the triumph over election denial. The headline in your column was a different and more nuanced and a little bit more dispiriting one, which was warning that a suppression storm is brewing. I'm wondering if you can explain the threats that you saw on Tuesday and before, and why, even as a lot of these denial candidates lost, we can't be as sanguine as the Times suggested today.
Yeah, I think that is really important, and I think that everything that Dan said is correct. I think when voters know what the issues are, what the stakes are, and I think the Democrats did a better job of explaining that, then they respond, rather than just what their opponents were running on. But I also, just because there were no big battles, just because we didn't see the crowd of people outside of a polling place in Detroit shouting, "Stop the vote," and we didn't see overt efforts of suppression or obstructionism, minor scattered things. I think it's really important to understand that that doesn't mean that voter suppression, it doesn't mean that election denialism and efforts to restrict access to the vote are over, that it was a success over that. It's important for America to see an election carried out without a glitch, but at the same time, what we were seeing were successes of people who were behind that kind of voter suppression efforts. And I started my column looking at Florida. You know, there weren't those kinds of problems, but you had a very clear victory by Rick DeSantis, who was able to win, and other Republicans were able to win in that state due to one of the most effective gerrymanders in the country that diluted the black vote. We see that happening. We see him not letting DOJ monitors into the polling places and getting away with it. We see him making a new playbook of voter suppression that's not going to look like it did under Trump, but it will probably be just as, I say, much more effective if other Republicans follow that playbook. So that is where I believe federal officials, voters, everyone else has to be vigilant and aware that this overperformance by Democrats is not a sign that the danger is over.
So I want to do a quick advertisement here, and the advertisement is to do a shout out to the 19th. And if you don't know what the 19th is, you ought to go look it up when you get done with this program. And nobody does a better job of coverage generally and of race and gender coverage than the 19th. And nobody does a better job in ensuring the 19th stays on track and getting it going in the first place than Errin. And I'd like to ask you, taking a cue from President Biden's questioners last night, I'm going to ask you 3 questions in one, if I can.
Okay.
And it's about 3 different waves. And the first is, was there in this election an anti-black wave, which you might have thought if you were looking at the results of candidates who lost in North Carolina and Wisconsin, and sadly, by large margins in Georgia? Or do you take hope from lesser offices and something that was going on in a more nuanced way under the surface in terms of what was going on in terms of black candidates in this election?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for that. Your Cash App will be here just as soon as we get off stage. Thanks for that plug.
1919.
Really, exactly. So appreciate you so much, and thank you. Going into this midterm cycle, I write a column every other week for the 19th, and basically was asserting a few things. 1, that democracy was going to be on the ballot. 2, that race was going to be on the ballot, and that women were going to be the deciders of this election. Well, frankly, I think because women are half the population and half the electorate, we will always be the deciders of every election, but certainly this year on the other side of Dobbs, that was going to be true. And so, I think to speak to some of the intersectionality that Dan and Kimberly have already spoken to, that was absolutely at play. And the thing about it is, race can be galvanizing for both parties, race and racism. We knew that the GOP, as I've written, you can write this story pretty much certainly every midterm, but really for the last few election cycles, the GOP has gone to, a racial playbook because it works. It works with a certain number of their voters, but it also works to galvanize Democrats, particularly black Democrats that are paying attention, who understand, that really does just kind of clarify the stakes for them. As much as they are voting for some of their candidates, they are also voting to reject that racism at the ballot. Whether it was voter suppression or whether it was some of the culture wars issues, the false narratives on crime that were out running in so many ads across the country, critical race theory, that kind of conversation, and just a conversation about what kind of history was going to be taught in our schools. That black voters, so many of the black voters that I talked to certainly heard a lot of that messaging, and that was the thing that was motivating them, alongside their concerns about the economy, alongside their concerns about threats to democracy, alongside their concerns about education, gun violence, many things. Racism was a pretty high issue, a topical issue. I think a lot of times, as political journalists, we can focus on, what is the single most important issue for you as a voter. And while, yes, that matters, if you ask them, okay, well, what about the other issues that matter a lot to you? Because no voter is really a single issue voter. A lot of people are voting around a number of things, and I think that race for a lot of black voters was certainly one of them.
So we're not done.
So I'm like, wait, this was a 3-parter. I'm like trying to keep up.
So the second part is, one of the big issues discussed before the election is what would happen to the Latino vote.
Yeah.
And what did we see, what do we know so far about how that played out? Did Republicans continue the gains that they were making? Did Latinos come back to the Democrats? Do we know enough yet to say what was going on?
Well, look, I mean, I think the majority of Latino voters, and frankly, the Latino candidates that had success coming out of election night, mostly Democratic. However, there were certainly some gains. And the thing about these midterms, as we're continuing to see in a lot of these are races that came down to the margins, right? And so to the extent that the Republican Party was able to pick off some number of Latino voters, some number of Black voters, some number of, suburban voters, Asian voters, like that mattered. And so, I mean, you look at Florida, Miami-Dade County, Latino voters were a big part of the success for Republicans in a place like that. That is something, I mean, Dan, for as long as you've been covering this stuff, that Republicans were really in play in that part of that state, in that part of the country, was remarkable. And so to the extent that the Republican Party did outreach to those communities and was able to make enough inroads for Latino voters to make the difference, I think that definitely holds lessons for 2024 and beyond.
So I'm going to hold the third part and come back to you later. And I want to bring EJ into the conversation here. And so we have heard endless analysis almost the moment the polls closed. Everybody starts looking to 2 years from now and understanding what it means on the Republican side in terms of Trump and DeSantis' big win. And I want to take us to the Democratic side. And we heard last night President Biden say either of two things. And what he said explicitly in the way it was covered today was, I'm going to be running again. What the cynic in me who was listening in a different way was hearing, I'm going to talk it over with my family, and I'm not going to give you an announcement tonight that I'm not going to run again. Let's pretend for a minute that either voluntarily or otherwise, Biden is not the Democrats' candidate in 2 years. Lots of elections happened this week that suggested that other people might be coming to the fore. I want to mention a few names, but I much want to hear your names and how you handicap this thing. So we obviously have the names of Harris and Buttigieg, but we had from California a big win by Gavin Newsom, and even more interesting to me is Alex Padillo's enormous win for the Senate there. We had defying expectations in New York that it was going to be a close race. We have a new Democratic governor of New York by a substantial margin. We have Amy Klobuchar, who is still around, and we have Sherrod Brown, who might be a dark horse from Ohio and a rare Democrat from Ohio. How do you see, if Joe Biden were to tell us in 2 weeks or 2 months, I'm going to go retire and I'm going to spend time with my grandchildren and it's wide open, how does this play out among the Democrats?
Well, before I get to that, which is pure speculation,
Absolutely.
what I want to do is first say, the audience may have noticed that almost all of us are back, and that's because we all love coming to this place, and this place is so important to this community. I grew up in this area down in Fall River, and I always joke when I'm here that in Fall River, when I was a kid, the turnout slogan was vote for the Kennedy of your choice, but vote. And so it's really good to be here. And Larry, it's great that he's got a great book on McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, and it's sheer accident that it came out in this, not
Right,
Kevin
not to be
McCarthy.
confused.
That's the
Right.
sequel. I want to just take real quick on the first questions, because on John Della Volpe, about 3 weeks ago, I tweeted that if young people were clearly about 2-to-1 Democratic all the way through this campaign. And I sent out a tweet saying if young people vote, Democrats can do reasonably well. If young people don't vote, Democrats will get clobbered. And I think this election may mark a transition that some of us have been looking toward of the next generation in really beginning to shape outcomes. Because I was a red wave skeptic, partly because for a whole lot of reasons, but one was young people and the possibility, but the other was women, which goes to your other question. Yep. And when you looked at, there was some polling early on, it didn't end up this high, but you could see some polling that was showing 59% of women were saying, at the time when everyone was selling the red wave, 59% of women were saying they're voting Democratic. So I think that the combination of women and young people were two of the biggest bulwarks against the red wave. But we can talk later about other reasons why that happened. In terms of the next election, I think all the names you mentioned are plausible. I am really fascinated by Gretchen Whitmer's victory in
the trifecta in Michigan.
And I'm sort of thinking that, everybody's talking about DeSantis, but Gretchen Whitmer is the anti-DeSantis. She not only swept, she got like 94% of the vote in Detroit, by the way. She not only swept the state, she helped bring in both houses of the legislature. Yes. The whole ticket, including the Attorney General and Secretary of State, is really important. And so I think she's an important figure. I think, even though I don't think he's going to run for president because soon, I think Josh Shapiro's victory in Pennsylvania is also a big deal because, again, if you look at those two states, those weren't just narrow wins. In states that were quite close to Pennsylvania and not overwhelming, not bad for Biden, but they really exceeded, both of them exceeded Biden's percentages. So I think that they are a big deal. I think, again, not in terms of presidential race, because I don't think we know. I think you can take all of the people who ran the last time, if Biden doesn't run, including Kamala Harris, including Buttigieg, including Klobuchar. I think all of them, once you want to be president, you never get rid of that. It's a sort of virus, and it goes into remission, but it comes back. And so I think all of them would like to run. I agree with you. Newsom interjected himself in a very interesting way in this election by taking on DeSantis and Greg Abbott down in Texas. I did a column on him during this campaign where he insisted to me, like he's insisting to everyone else, that he is not running for president. No way, not in, it's just hard to believe that he's not at least a little bit interested, and he was really happy to chat.
He may not have the virus, but he's got a bug, huh?
Yeah, okay. I think, and
did you notice he and DeSantis have had a back and forth for quite some time because he injected himself into Florida over the last year or so. Somebody on the DeSantis team tweeted, DeSantis won by a bigger margin in his state than Gavin Newsom won in his blue state, as a way of tweaking.
Yeah,
so
that would be quite a... The other person, by the way, I put on the list is Cory Booker, because I think Cory Booker was somebody who I think ended up, even though he didn't win, ended up stronger at the end of that race than he started, that the race actually was good for him. And if I could shout out three of my favorite people because of what they're fighting for, there's this, I think when you're looking ahead to issues that we're going to face, Booker, Sherrod Brown, whom you mentioned, and Michael Bennet have been passionate about the child tax credit. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the big fights we're going to see going forward is whether we put the child tax credit back in, which was one of the most unifying across racial lines and other lines in the country, but also a huge help to both middle class and poor families.
Yes. Immediately impactful and transformative for people.
And it dropped the child poverty rate by 40%. It's a shame it got it was allowed to go away. I think that's going to be a big fight, and I think all three of them are going to be important figures because they are the people pushing it, and Rosa DeLauro down in Connecticut is also going to be there. But so that's where. But on Biden, I have no idea, and I think that. I think his gut is he'd love to do it. His feeling, he's the guy who can beat Trump, and he's not sure anybody else can. Right. And I think he's very aware of his age. I don't think he is, I don't think he's indifferent to that. And so I heard him the way you did, which is, yes, I'm running And by the way, I'm consulting with my family and I'll let you know. And that's how, and I think that's sort of where he is.
And I think, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and I mean, if you know anything about President Biden, it is that he will take his time in letting us know. And whatever deadline he gives us, he's going to blow through that by a good few months before he finally ends up making a decision. So to think that, you know, directly on the other side of these midterms that he was going to give us a real answer, no.
If the Democrats had done as badly as some Republicans thought they were going to do, there would have been an immediate debate and call for him not to run.
Sure.
So the fact that they did pretty well takes a lot of pressure off
Got some
him
breathing room.
and gives him space to make this decision, and probably reinforces his own instincts that the way he's governing actually is appealing to a lot of people, and that he's still the best person to run.
He's had the best 24 hours he's had in a long time. First the election, and then this morning the news that inflation is coming down. You know, he must be really happy today, I
Well,
think.
we knew he was confident even before that when he called that 4 o'clock.
Yes,
that
4 o'clock
press,
news
you know,
Yeah.
press appearance. We thought, oh, okay, the president is happy. He's feeling pretty strong.
By the way, not to bust up your brilliant questioning, I want to just say one other thing. Latinos, I think the problem with the conversation about Latinos is we act as if Latinos are one big,
Yes.
giant, monolithic
Please,
group.
can we stop?
And they are, you know, it's like saying all white people. Yeah, tell me about that in Massachusetts with the Irish and the Italians and the French Canadians and the Poles and all the rest. And that Latinos are both a whole lot of people from different parts of the world, and they are different also because those groups bulk larger in different places. So South Florida,
Yes,
Latinos
is not Texas,
are,
is not Arizona,
are
is
Cuban
not-
and Venezuelan and
not
Colombian,
New York.
and but most Latinos around the country are Mexican American. And I think the test is going to be whether Cortez Masto pulls out that Senate race, because I think. Oh, there are also, by the way, splits between evangelical and non-evangelical Latinos.
And even different states.
Yes.
I mean, where
California
the issues
and
on the
Texas.
ground are not the same. Yeah.
Nevada, she is doing very, very well with
Yes.
Latinos. In Arizona, Mark Kelly is not doing as well as she's doing in Nevada. So, you know, now those two
which
states,
proves-
even though they're
Yeah.
both heavily
And
Mexican American.
Dan, since we're on Nevada for a second,
Yeah.
you've been talking to people there. You have a sense that the votes that remain to be counted could skew Democratic and
Well, I mean, my sense is based on a couple of Democrats that I talked to today, who, you know, they're looking at the vote, they're looking at what's still out. They have some sense, as new votes that have come in get counted, kind of what that rough division is between Cortez Masto and Laxalt. She's down by about, she was, as when we came over here, about 15,000 votes down. But a couple of things have happened. One, that's a little smaller than it was yesterday at this time. Washoe County, which is Reno and north up into the remote areas, moved from his column to her column overnight. Again, that's a narrow switch. The Democrats think, based on everything they're looking at, that she can overcome the deficit she now has. They're not, you know, they're not saying we've got this in the bag, but they think they can get there. And if that's the case, that's a huge shift, because it, you know, if Kelly holds on in Arizona, it makes the runoff in Georgia not irrelevant, but not as crucial.
Not less relevant. And Larry, can I just say for a
Please.
second, I mean, I just want to shout out our profession for managing expectations going into election season, right? Because there's no such thing as election day or night anymore. It is season. And even as obviously we're up here sitting here unpacking the still unfolding results of the midterm, to really temper in people's minds that we were not going to know the answer right away. I think that is something, tempering that so as to not to raise the specter of a rigged election or election fraud just because we didn't immediately know the answer.
Yes.
I have to say that is something that that is something that we know and that I feel really good about on the other side of this, that was not something that was really allowed to proliferate and metastasize in people's minds across the country. So
I agree with that, and there's also this wonderful cognitive dissonance that would exist if the pro-Trump candidates said, we've got to keep counting in Arizona, but we want to stop the
Yes.
count in Nevada. There's something contradictory there. Although, who knows, we might hear that.
So EJ, taking to heart that when you said that Latino voters in Texas are different from voters in Florida, I want to drill down to a couple states that have interesting, I think, stories that are in the process of being told but not yet. Starting, Errin, with your state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Is it going too far to say that the Fetterman victory is in a way a victory for disability rights, and that the idea that you had a candidate there who was recovering from a stroke and you had a doctor sort of pointing on the other side and laughing at that, is this all about Pennsylvania politics, or does it suggest that something is maybe hopeful happening in terms of somebody with a disability can run and help explain that?
So I think that's part of it. But there is also it was a very Pennsylvania race, right? I think there were a lot of people, a lot of voters that I heard from who certainly empathized with John Fetterman, who thought it was brave for him to continue on in the campaign in the way that he did, and to be increasingly, I would say, transparent about his struggles on the other side of his health challenges. However, the other thing about Pennsylvania, I live in Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania loves an underdog, right? They love a fighter, and what his message to voters, especially, I mean, even going into this race, but especially after his stroke, was when you get knocked down, you get back up. And there are so many communities in Pennsylvania that felt like they had been knocked down and were trying to get back up. And that was a message that really resonated with a lot of people. The other thing you have is, Pennsylvania, it really was the underdog versus the outsider, right? I mean, Dr. Oz wasn't just not from Pennsylvania, he was from New Jersey. Like, no, that is not okay to Pennsylvania voters, right? So, the really smart and savvy social media hits on him being, from New Jersey and coming over across the river to run for Senate in Pennsylvania, I think that was something that also really resonated with a lot of Pennsylvania voters who said, okay, no, this guy, no, we're voting for the guy that's from where we're from. People took a lot of pride in that too, and I think that those three factors really kind of, I think, helped propel him to victory.
Can I express at least hope that there might have been another factor? This is someone whose claim to fame was selling phony diet pills on a TV show. I mean, I think Republicans, particularly, the more Donald Trump got a hold of this party, had a real quality problem that they thought they'd be able to overcome just with a Trump endorsement. And this election was evidence that it is not necessarily the case. Dr. Oz was a terrible candidate. He just was. I mean, he didn't even know how to put a vegetable tray together. I mean, it was just, that has to be a part of the reason why that election was so decisive.
The crudité vote, I did forget to mention the crudité vote.
Yeah, the crudité was... I was up there we were talking before, for the Obama-Biden event, and somebody on the Fetterman campaign told me that the other great thing that happened to them at the end was Oprah endorsing Fetterman. Yeah. And they said, if nothing else, the one thing the media cared about was Oprah. And so we got a lot of coverage.
They cared about it. I broke that on Twitter because I was literally watching her, have this kind of get out the vote event online with supporters. And she just casually chimed in, by the way, if I lived in Pennsylvania, I would have, something that people have been waiting to hear from her for months. I mean, she stayed out of the primary, and then days before the election, she finally weighs in and says, I'm with Fetterman, and
Errin,
that gave him a boost among some people.
Do you know the backstory of that endorsement? Was it just spontaneous on her part?
No,
or
I mean,
did somebody make an ask?
When she announced that she was going to have this GOTV rally online, so many people on Twitter were saying, are you going to weigh in on Fetterman? Like, are you finally going to endorse Fetterman and reject Oz? So, like, I think it was a thing that she knew that this was a thing that was out there and that people were wanting to hear from her on, and she decided that was the forum that she was going to do it in. Yeah.
So, Kim, you proved to me this afternoon, even more than you have in your columns, how much you understand about what goes on in electoral politics generally and in New England, where we had either of two waves. Maybe it was a blue wave, maybe it was a lavender wave, maybe it was both in terms of the elections in this state and in New Hampshire and in Maine. Can you put sort of what happened here in context? Are we just an anomaly, or was there something here that matters, resonates beyond here in terms of what happened?
Yeah, I don't think it's an anomaly at all. I mean, I spent some time thinking about what happened here in Massachusetts, this is a state where voters love a moderate Republican in the governor's office. I mean, they just do. I mean, I've been here since the 90s, or covered this place since the 90s, and there's been one Democratic governor in all of that time. And so this really was a place where Republicans had some power. But the state party became this shrinking, Trumpy, just ineffective group. So what they did was they chose Trump over actual power. And so a Democrat won the governor's office. The voters here love a split government. And they gave that up for Trump. And that is not just happening here. I think an argument could be made that also happened in places like Michigan, where I grew up, where moderate Republicans are very popular, even among union members and others. And they would like that, but they also don't like kidnapping plots against their governor, So you have a Democrat winning there. You have a Democrat winning in Wisconsin. You have a Democrat winning in Maryland, another place where one of the very popular Republican governor was, but you had a Trump candidate succeeding him, so then the Democrat won there. And I think that's a lesson in a lot of places, and certainly those can be bellwethers for 2024 about what happens. I feel like it's like the Republican Party is like a reduction sauce, right? Like the more you cook it, it becomes more intense, but it also shrinks. And I think you're seeing evidence of that.
So can we stick for 1 second with Wisconsin? To me, one of the bumper sticker lines, the two bumper sticker lines in the election were before the election, McConnell saying that we had bad quality candidates, and that certainly seems to have been borne out. My favorite post-election line was from the governor of Wisconsin, Governor Evers, when he won re-election, saying, "Boring wins." That seems to be what you're describing in the way the campaign was run here for governor of Massachusetts. Is that something in this era of high drama that maybe boring really does win?
Yeah, confidence, steadiness wins, competence wins. And I think when you have people who are known commodities, now, let's be honest too, in Massachusetts on the Democratic side, there was no competition. The field was more or less cleared for Maura Healey. That doesn't mean that she's not qualified, competent, popular in all of those things, but that was slightly different than in other places. But I think voters are willing, by and large, to reject the unknown, reject something that is a clear lack of qualifications, or just something that's just not inherent in the DNA of a place. Trumpism, even though it took control of the Republican Party here, that's not inherent in the DNA in a place like Massachusetts, or even in Michigan. When you come down to it, yes, there are very, very right-wing and extremist parts of Michigan. Again, I'm from there, I know. But when you put it to the whole electorate and when you tell them what is at stake, and another interesting thing about that is abortion was on the ballot in Michigan.
Yes, literally.
No, that was huge.
Literally.
Yeah, and that tells you something in a fairly conservative state like that, what that means moving forward. That's what I mean by when you tell the voters what's at stake, then they respond. And I think that Democrats are doing a better job of that. They did a terrible job of that for years and years and years. And I think by putting abortion on the ballot, as opposed to, being careful, like, no, only thing that people care about is inflation. No, they can care about many things at once, like Errin pointed out, and I think that makes a major difference.
And let me just say, too, I mean, look, boring may have counted for Tony Evers, but the Senate race in Wisconsin was not boring in the least. And, I was actually on the ground in Wisconsin earlier this week, just before the election. And what was interesting was the Republican message was, we need to vote for change. You got Democrats controlling all of these offices in Wisconsin. Oh, but not Senator Johnson, though. Like, keep him, but let's get rid of everybody else. And, that even though Ron Johnson said, I'm only doing 2 terms and I'm done, yet here he is again, right? But raised a lot of questions around his involvement around January 6th, the big lie, whatever. But really, as voters started to kind of pay attention in the home stretch of the general election after Labor Day, as you see just the wave of ads around crime and that racial playbook again coming in on Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, I think that definitely did hurt him, and that race was nationalized, not necessarily even as much as some of the others, but I mean, it was nationalized because in that same way that crime just became an issue that really made the difference in a race that was already going to be close. But I mean, Milwaukee, record number of murders. I mean, that's something that grabs people's attention, and that, frankly, is still a very potent topic to motivate people to the polls.
Fear,
I think
fear,
Yes.
whether or not there's actual things like rising crime or not, fear is a motivator. I mean, I talked to a Republican voter on air, on radio, on WBUR, who kept, when I asked about immigration, and he kept bringing it back to crime.
Yes.
And I said, okay, wait a minute, we can talk about crime, but right now I'm talking about immigration, which is a different subject, and kept linking it to crime. It's like, no, the data shows that people who are in the United States without authorization are much less likely to commit a crime, a violent crime, when they're here than others. So if we want to talk about crime, that's fine. But it's that messaging. It was a talking point that's fear-driven, fear of crime, fear that my kid's is going to be denied a spot in a school because of affirmative action, fear that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are going to do something bad to me. That's so effective. That's why Republicans keep going to it again and again. And we see fear about, kids being taught that being white is terrible in their schools. It's fear because it's effective.
Yeah, I agree with both what you've said and what Errin said. I think there's another factor about this election more broadly, and that is that the power of incumbency was significant.
Yes.
100%.
So if you look at, Evers in Wisconsin and Johnson in Wisconsin, 2 incumbents.
Brian Kemp in Georgia.
Brian Kemp
for
in Georgia.
For sure, that was a factor.
Abbott in Texas. The numbers that Mike DeWine rolled up in Ohio. This was not a throw the bums out election.
No.
And so if you could cling to that and you were seen as competent and steady, that helped you make it through a tough environment.
That goes back to where you started on the boring thing. The other line on this from this election that stuck with me was Tim Ryan, who didn't make it in Ohio, but he talked about the exhausted majority.
Yes.
And I think that what you saw, I think he was really onto something that was going on out there and why people voted for a whole lot of non-hot button candidates. If you look at all of the class of 2018, the women, a lot of women in that Democratic class elected in the 2018 sweep. A lot of fairly moderate people, a lot of them with military experience or a Spanberger from the CIA. These were just competent, trustworthy people who won, in many cases, by much bigger margins than people expected. And then some of the governors, like Whitmer, and it goes back to your point about the Trumpification of the Republican Party. Here were the Republicans quite capable of winning in Maryland and in Massachusetts. And if they nominated the right kind of candidates. And the party, I love your reduction sauce metaphor.
We're all going to steal that.
They're going to steal that.
Still thinking about the reduction
They could have held up, they could win these governorships, but they threw it away. And so you elected 2 really interesting Democrats in Westmore and Maura Healey. And Healey was really aware of that. I interviewed her up here in August. And I asked her about Charlie Baker, and she had an awful lot of nice things to say about Charlie Baker. She knew where her majority was going to come from.
So EJ, everything you just said makes sense, except that the perfect test case of that was in Ohio. You had the hot button candidate in running against Ryan. Why didn't Ryan win Ohio?
When the dam is too high, you just can't get over it. I mean, in Ohio, the Trump carried it by over 8 points.
8 points twice.
And twice. I talked to a Democratic pollster who said that the challenge was that a lot of voters in that state thought that Tim Ryan was the better candidate, whom they liked, running on the party they didn't trust, versus a candidate they didn't really like, running on the party they trusted. And the pollsters saw some evidence toward the end of a lot of Republicans coming home. Certainly, that's what's happened in Ohio, and I think that happened in some other states. So I think that was, I think that's what happened in Ohio, is the party trumped, as it were, the fact that Tim Ryan was very well liked at the end of that campaign by a lot of Republicans.
Not to mention, though, I mean, so you look at, Trump winning by 8 points in 2020 and 2016, winning that state, and Democratic Party says, well, is this the best use of our resources? Should we be? Tim Ryan did not have the full-throated backing of that party in terms of resources, in terms of what it was going to take for him to pull that kind of upset off. That's not where his support came from.
The one where I wish they had spent more was Sherry Beasley.
And I was going to just say the same thing was true in North Carolina.
I was joking that I was doing the underdog tour this fall because I went to Ohio and I went to North Carolina. North Carolina is really close.
She was in play, yeah.
And, that Biden didn't lose that by very much the last time. And maybe they were, I understand scarce resources, and they may, if they hold the Senate, then they can argue they placed their bets pretty well. But she was a really interesting candidate, a very moderate, first black state Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And there's a real history of Democratic organizing there. I think what's going to happen is Democrats are going to give up on Florida and start looking a lot more fondly at North Carolina as organizing goes forward.
Yeah, but not investing in Florida or North Carolina means that you still have no black women in the Senate. Right? And as black voters are looking for a return on their investment, looking for representation.
Beasley was
that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think it was a huge opportunity, and they didn't sort of play it.
Yeah.
One, and this is a question, it's not a prediction, but I'm wondering if one of the lessons that comes out of this for Democrats is for years and years and years, Democrats have told folks like us, it's like, we really need to try to win back those non-college educated men, which read non-college educated white men, and really focus more on them and bring them back into the party. And that was Ryan's MO, right? And it didn't work out. But where we started this conversation was young voters, and where we are talking now are voters of color. And we, in the Emancipator, we had a piece before the election that talked about the other swing voter.
Yes.
And what that is are young people, mostly, especially people of color. And the swing isn't trying to get them from the Republican side. The swing is, do they vote or do they stay home?
Persuasion
And
voters.
now that is going to be the new crucial constituency, particularly when these races remain this close, to focus on. And there's been this big debate. I was talking to a Democrat today who lamented the fact that part of Joe Biden's closing argument before the midterms was about how he forgave some student loans. And I'm like, what are you talking about? That was one of the things he had to do. He had to talk about this and the economy. He had to talk about that and infrastructure. He had to talk about that and democracy. But you can't say that is some sort of liability for Democrats to do. I think that he handled all of those things pretty well in his closing argument, and I wonder now if Democrats, given the results that we saw this week, start to realize that.
Just to say one quick word in defense of Tim Ryan and Sherrod Brown.
Sure.
Both of them have been very careful in their politics, I think, to take very seriously the fact that the black vote is hugely important to them. And Ryan would talk about class issues in a transracial, dare we say, intersectional kind of way, and that the idea was these folks should vote together because they have shared interests. Now, we can have a long conversation about the complexity of that, and I agree it's complex, but that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to build an old cross-racial coalition
That
that
is what-
acknowledges some shared interests.
I appreciate that. That is what he was trying to do. And on the more progressive side, that's essentially what Bernie was trying to do, right? This rising tide raises all boats. Well, Black people know that when the tide rises, they usually drown. So it doesn't work. It doesn't always work. It hasn't worked for decades. And so I think that's something that Democrats really should consider, and it'll be interesting to see if they do.
So the idea that we're talking about states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan is not surprising after a midterm like this. The idea that we're looking at arguably, at least when it came to the House, the Democrats' weakest link and biggest losses is New York.
Yeah.
What went on in New York?
Reapportionment.
I was gonna say
and
gerrymandering.
blowing reapportionment and Hochul winning by a small margin. I think that the Democrats drew this very, shall we say, aggressive map to try to get as many seats as they could out of New York to counter the Republican aggressive maps. Unfortunately for the Democrats, Republican judges in their states let those gerrymanders go through, but Democratic judges in New York threw out the Democratic gerrymander, and a special master redrew districts, and it really hurt the Democrats. So line drawing is part of
Yes.
it. But I think, and I think Sean Patrick Maloney alluded to this today, that in the governor's race, Zeldin lost, but Democrats are accustomed to much bigger margins than Hochul got in this race. And it's still pretty healthy. 5 points in most places looks pretty good, but it was
But in New York,
historically
though, yeah.
not what they were getting, and that the vote was down in the Hudson Valley. So I think the combination of the two was the killer. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't drawn those lines. I think you would have had some of them survive. I'm curious what you figured out there.
No, I think that's right. You know New York better than I do on that front. I think that's right, that the governor's race was a much tougher race than the Democrats needed in order to be able to bring everybody out. There's another state where the Democrats are facing some significant losses, which is California in the House. I mean, there's 7 or 8 races that are still not counted, and in California we know that count will go on for another 2 weeks probably. In 2018, that late counting swelled the Democratic victories in the margins, and it brought them up to a wave election, frankly. It's not clear how those will turn out, but New York and California, ironically, could be the places that would, if you will, could keep the Democrats from actually holding the House. That may be an exaggeration, but I think that's pretty.
Simon Rosenberg, a Democratic analyst whom Dan quoted in his piece today, makes the point that there may be a particular blue state election that went on here, where some of these, crime, homelessness, those sometimes referred to as quality of life issues. I'm not sure I like that reference point, but that those have played in those states. And also that the abortion issue doesn't quite have the power in those states because people in those states know abortion is going to remain legal in New York and it's going to remain legal in California. I'm not fully convinced of all of this, but I think there is something to the fact that Dan we happen to be mentioning congressional races that could be lost in New York and California. And I think we're going to have to figure out, beyond line drawing, which was important, what else was going on.
And the previous mention of how well the Democrats did in the legislature in Michigan is a result of much fairer maps that were drawn there
Yes.
as a result of redistricting reform. So
The contrast between Michigan and Wisconsin is shocking.
Yes.
but in Wisconsin, the Republicans were going for a veto-proof majority, and they appear not to have gotten
Correct.
it.
Yes.
Right, but I mean, those maps are
Those
just
maps
so
are
radically
way,
gerrymandered, whereas Michigan got fair maps.
So you got us wound up on gerrymandering, Larry. It's
I
your
love
fault.
it. So I want to wind you up on something else, and that is the. So
It's a good issue, you're right.
Listen, it's important. You get
really
reporters going.
interesting ballot questions across the country. The
Yes.
one that I found most interesting, and Errin, I'd love you to speak to this, is what happened on abortion in Kentucky.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought you were going to ask me about all the slavery initiatives that were on the ballot, which were
We can
very
talk about
fascinating. In 2022, that's right, slavery was on the ballot in America in 5 states, and I think We know the outcome in 4 of those states, and maybe are still waiting to find out what Montana is going to do. But anyway, yes, with abortion being on the ballot, I mean, I think we saw a preview of this summer with Kansas, and that being very shocking to people. Look, again, abortion may not have been the top issue for people, but it mattered. It mattered to a lot of folks, and I mean, not just to women, but to the people who know women, you know, the people who may also be impacted by this Dobbs decision, and also the other effects of the Dobbs decision. And so,
Can you explain what happened in Kentucky for anybody who doesn't know?
can I explain what happened in Kentucky? Shorthand. Geez, this is my fried midterm brain now.
So basically,
Go for
yes.
it, Larry.
So what happened is they had a referendum on whether to eliminate the protection for abortion
Yes.
in the Constitution.
Right. Yes.
And they wanted to, the initiative would have struck it down, and it was not only upheld, but as I recall, by a fairly substantial margin.
Despite how complicated it was.
Despite
Right,
how complicated and despite it being Mitch McConnell's Kentucky.
So that's
Well, it was
what I was
complicated in
looking to articulate. is
Kansas
that-
as well.
No, in Kansas also.
Kansas,
the
right,
wording
no,
of
right,
that.
right,
Yes.
right.
So yes, so it was that the language was tricky, and yet voters still understood what was at stake and rejected what it was that they were trying to do in Kentucky. And yeah, and it is Kentucky. But again, I think, you know, even with so much of the polling that we're doing across the country where you know, you have a majority of Americans really not wanting, really being shocked by the Dobbs decision and kind of the effect of the Dobbs decision as we see these trigger laws taking effect in states across the country, as we are hearing the stories, especially the most extreme stories about what's happening, the consequences on the other side of Dobbs. I think that those stories are shocking to a lot of Americans, and probably was the case in Kentucky as well.
Can I say one thing about this? Because this is one thing that I got, I don't know, okay, I'll say I got it wrong. I wasn't sure, I will say this. When asked, would the Dobbs decision work in favor of Democrats by mobilizing voters, I wasn't sure. Now, one thing I didn't take into account is literally abortion being on the ballot, right? That in these cases, which I think made a big difference. But in the past, after really horrible things have happened, you know, Sandy Hook, was gun control on the ballot? Did people storm to? No. You know, after Black Lives Matter, by and large, yes, there were some police reform bills passed, but did they really have teeth? No. And in fact, a lot of the protections got rolled back after the whole nation, all at home, not being able to go out, watching George Floyd be lynched in the street, and all of that outcry, there was not the resulting march to the polls. So when everyone's like, oh, well, women are gonna go to the polls, and I'm like, are they? I mean, we keep saying that that's gonna happen. And there may be this idea that women who have means know that they can still access abortion. But I think you're right. And one thing, when the stories started coming out, and especially when these people started learning that many of these bills would mean, if you're in an emergency situation, you could be a billionaire and you're in a hospital in an emergency situation, and if your jet can't, you know, you can't helipad out of the hospital to Massachusetts, you're still in a lot of trouble. I think the stakes became more clear, and then it was on the ballot in a way that made it a much bigger issue than I thought that it would be. So that's, I admit when I'm not, my analysis is not right.
I think that was the big issue, the big question that kind of got lost at the end. I think that we all sort of said, well, it seems to have faded as an issue, but if you talk to women, I spent some time in Colorado in August talking to people who had gotten activated after Trump got elected, and the Dobbs decision, it was like it just re-energized them in a very visceral way.
Yes.
And when people are affected in that way, that doesn't go away in 2 months or 3 months or 4 months.
No, and there
and you
was
saw-
actually no real evidence that it had gone away. You know, it may have dropped a little bit
No.
in some polls relative to inflation, but there was never any evidence. And one of the smartest things I heard about this, the politics of it, was from a Republican pollster named Whit Ayers, who said that in most midterm elections, there is one incumbent government that people are voting up or down on in the case of unified government. He said the Supreme Court turned itself into a second incumbent government.
Yep.
And so it wasn't just the backlash against the Democrats in Congress and Biden, it was also a backlash against a Republican Supreme Court. And I think it was really striking to watch Republican candidates after the Kansas referendum and Pat Ryan's, I'm in Boston, I'm quoting a lot of Ryans, Pat Ryan's victory in the special election in New York. Republicans went all mushy on abortion. People who had said, they would begin by saying, I'm strongly pro-life, and then say, in many cases, really not want to answer questions
that general election
about
shift.
what that actually meant.
Yeah.
And that showed more than anything how powerful this issue was. You must have run into this too, how they were running away from it, scrubbing their websites.
Well, you know,
It was remarkable.
I wrote about this in my column today. I was talking to somebody over at Susan B. Anthony List who was saying, I mean, any Republican candidate that kind of took this ostrich or possum strategy when it came to abortion and was not clear about where they stood. I mean, those were the candidates that did not have success, to the extent that you had governors, that you had folks running for Senate in the Republican Party who did not really waver or back away from, whatever their stance was in the primary or before the Dobbs decision. Those candidates were able to be successful. But I mean, just to go back to, abortion as a galvanizing issue, I mean, certainly at the 19th, that's something that we saw throughout, you saw the voter registration numbers for women really skyrocket in a number of states where folks were particularly concerned about what the post-Dobbs reality was going to be. But you had women really in the prime of their reproductive years and also becoming of voting age. So two rights that they felt like were at stake being, potentially taken away from them. They were very motivated. You also had, I mean, so many women that I talked to, voters who were around and alive and adult young women before Roe, and they knew what that was like, and they were so enraged at the idea that they could be here again because they remember what things were like before. And so it was an intergenerational thing too among women that we really saw. And so to EJ's point, striking that blow.
In terms of it's also extraordinary timing in terms of the 19th coming to life during all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look.
Couldn't have picked.
I mean, gender. We certainly believe that all gender is political, and that all politics are gendered. So, I mean, we are at the intersection of everything. We launched our newsroom a week before the Iowa caucuses and 3 months before the pandemic, and yet both of those issues ended up having implications for gender and implications for race, for class. I mean, just everything that is directly in our wheelhouse, and certainly the reproductive rights and access conversation has been huge for us as well.
So I want to just take a break from our talking to ourselves here and see whether this is the time we're supposed to invite live audience participation, questions from anybody who's zooming in. People just line up at the mics. Is that the way we do it? Great.
Hi.
Hi, thank you guys and ladies for your wonderful insights. I'm sure everyone is old enough to remember when Ohio and Florida used to be considered swing states. Sure. I don't think that's the case anymore, and I'm sure you guys would agree with me, but could you just tell me, like, what happened out there that to make them more right-leaning than they used to be, or am I mistaken?
No, you're absolutely right. And EJ and I are old enough to remember when California and Illinois and New Jersey were swing states, which is true back in the day. There are events and candidates that can have an effect on the political culture of a state. And I think that what we've seen in the Trump era is that Iowa and Ohio and now Florida have shifted from being genuine swing states to being pretty solidly red. Mm-hmm. The DeSantis victory yesterday, Tuesday, and Marco Rubio had a similarly big victory. This wasn't just DeSantis. No. That state has shifted.
But DeSantis in particular, I mean, because what a difference 4 years makes. 4 years ago, that guy barely got through.
Both the Senate race in 2018 and the governor's race in 2018 were basically 1-point races. Mm-hmm. And now one is a 19-point race, and Rubio was what, 14 or 17 or something like that. Wow. one of the points that Errin made earlier is, as that begins to happen, the party that's losing begins to disinvest in those places. And so it feeds on itself. And the fact that Tim Ryan was not able to pull it through in Ohio will be a signal to Democrats, well, put our money elsewhere. And similarly in Florida, the Democratic Party down there is kind of a mess. Texas has been a place that Democrats for 30 years have not really invested in, and local Democrats in Texas have begged for money. Yep. Beto tried to, bring it back, and people thought that the demographics of that state would turn it blue over time. So far, that hasn't happened, but the cities in Texas are now blue, and lots of the other areas are red. But these things happen in a period, and I think right now, Florida and Ohio and Iowa are, you have to count them as red states.
Are they reversible?
Are they reversible? Not in the immediate future.
Yeah.
Okay.
You also have, I agree with everything Dan said, you also have changing demographics in all those states that Iowa in particular is getting a pretty older population, and age is a real Republican-Democratic divide now.
Yes.
Older people.
As we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And then Florida's population has also changed. The nature of the Latino population has changed with the influx of Venezuelans and Colombians and others who are more conservative than the earlier generation of, say, Central American Latinos, adding to the Cuban vote, which was always more conservative. So I think that these changes are feeding on the trends that were already there. Do they change? Yeah, well, they do change, because look at California, which used to be seen as a Republican state. It was Ronald Reagan's state. Right. And we forget how Republican that looked for a while.
And more recently,
and it's not
Georgia.
true
And
anymore.
Illinois
What about
was a
Georgia?
classic bellwether.
But I mean, look, what happened in 2020? I mean, Georgia certainly, all eyes were on Georgia in 2020 headed into that runoff, and so you had, really the coalition that was built by Black women organizers like Stacey Abrams and others there. Black Voters Matter, really putting in the work to make the coalition that turned that state blue in that cycle. But I mean, look, Georgia was the last Southern state to finally go Republican. The last two Republican governors before Brian Kemp were former Democrats, right? So, but with all that being said, Georgia is not, it's purple at best. It's certainly not blue, and it's really still pretty red. Now, what's going to happen in this runoff? I think, to Dan's point, a lot of it depends on what happens with these pending races in Nevada and Arizona. But the idea that Herschel Walker was within striking distance, even given kind of his candidate quality issues, if you will, I think really does just continue to speak to the power of that party, really propelled by a pretty popular incumbent governor who, frankly, some Democrats and independents did not have a problem with.
We used to think in presidential races, and not that long ago, that the number of battleground states was 12 to 16, somewhere in that range. And we're now down to 7. And it's not a coincidence that the 7 states that we were focused on in 2020 are the 7 states we're focused on in this election, and that we'll focus on
again in
2024. Those are the 7 states that right now decide the fate of the country.
Question from this side?
We have a question from an online viewer. If we credit people under 40 for the Democrats' smaller than expected loss, how much do you credit Black people and Black women, particularly in states where redrawing of districts is obvious?
Yeah, look, I think Black women are a huge part of the equation. I said that in 2020, and I think we're going to see, I know we're still getting kind of exit polling, that Black women were a factor in several of these key states. It's certainly the reason that Raphael Warnock finds himself in a runoff. It is why Stacey Abrams was within striking distance, although she was not able to pull it off in Georgia. For Black women, especially a lot of the issues that were at play in this particular midterm, the relationship between abortion, democracy, freedom. I mean,
Yes.
that is something that they clearly understood, just the overall conversation about bodily autonomy and the
Yes.
loss of rights, the potential loss of rights and future rights was something that galvanized them. And the thing about Black women, which was interesting because I think you finally started to see Republicans begin to embrace this as a strategy in some places. Black women it's never about their vote alone. They always take somebody else from their community, whether it's their sorority sister, their church member, other people in their family. Like, you know, one Black woman is worth, you know, at least 10 votes, if not more.
So
Seriously,
It's
seriously.
true.
And so,
yeah, and
I mean, that's, so yes, I mean, Black women are always going to be, you know, a factor in a democracy because it's never just about, I mean, they're going to ask their coworkers, strangers, frankly, you know, did you vote today? And make sure that if they didn't, that they know how and will encourage them to do it.
And it's
Black
not just
women-
the turnout, it's right, because, and this is why the issue of gerrymandering is going to be so important, is because Republicans realize this, that Black women don't just turn out, they don't just see all of these issues. I mean, we haven't really talked about January 6th even. I mean, Black women saw January 6th coming, and after that, but there's no pickoff. I mean, we're talking about how the Latino vote is not monolithic and stuff, but Republicans made quite a bit of inroads, particularly with Latino men. Republicans have made tiny, but not insignificant inroads with Black men, and when these races are this close, Black women were not having it. Like, there would have been zero inroads, and so that is why the redistricting and the gerrymandering became the game, because you had to dilute the power of that vote. But Black women will be. The thing that makes me sad about that is that it's so easy then for Democrats to take them for granted.
Yeah.
Because they always do the job. They're always expected to do the job. They're ready to be blamed. You know, how many they were ready to be blamed if Democrats perform poorly. That seems to be a repetitive, perennial issue.
Question here, sir.
First of all, thank you all for coming. I know that you had better things to do, and some of you did this last night in Harvard. So, but I want to continue the discussion with respect to the gerrymandering and the redistricting, because it appears that DeSantis in Florida and Lee Zeldin in New York is now giving the opportunity for the House to be Republican. And as of 6 o'clock, it looked like 221 to 214, plus or minus California. So I would like you to address, if it ends up 219, 220 for the Republicans, depending on California, is it assured Kevin McCarthy or someone like Kevin McCarthy will be the speaker if the Democrats have 217 and they can make a deal with somebody? And maybe just address that, because that's the one part of the House discussion that we haven't heard about tonight. Thank you.
I love that question because I've been playing in my head with that question, and that because you've had, certainly in states, you've had situations where renegade factions in one party would leave and join and elect a coalition speaker. That's happened, and it's happened at certain moments in our own history, but often when there is no clear majority, and there were a number of third party like populists or others like that. The problem I have is trying to run through in my head who among the Republicans in the House would be those renegades.
Well, they
that
don't
it
have to
might
be,
have
they don't even
been
have to be in the House.
20. No, but
No,
we're
no,
talking
to vote.
to vote
To vote for the
coalition.
speaker,
to vote for
who could be the
for
speaker. Right.
And there might have been a time 20, 25 years ago where I could see a group of progressive Republicans, genuinely progressive Republicans, maybe breaking under these kinds of circumstances. I just can't find them. I think of like Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania was one name on my list. Is he going to break? I don't think so. And so
They will take the lesson of what happened to Liz Cheney.
Right, unless they decide to completely change their politics. Here's the other one I've been thinking of, just along your lines. which was Lisa Murkowski. Lisa Murkowski is going to get elected in Alaska with Democratic votes on the second round, that she came in second to the conservative Republican on the first round, and it's the second preferences of a Democrat who's going to elect her.
Yeah.
I have been wondering if Chuck Schumer might be on the phone with Lisa Murkowski. Now, I don't think she'll do it, but sure, she has certain reasons to think about it. And in fact, she made an alliance with the Democratic congresswoman. They endorsed each other in this election, Portola. And so maybe there's some coalitions in our future somewhere. But
Listen,
But wouldn't it be delightful to see a 219, 217 House? And
oh boy, that would be fun.
imagine all of the craziness that would add up to the current level of craziness.
I would, maybe I'll leave Washington if that helps.
Question here.
Yeah. First off, thank you. What an incredible amount of talent up there. I'm surprised the stage hasn't collapsed. There's a lot of discussions about a lot of things, and we've been going through this ever since Trump came down that stupid elevator. Now, my question is, what in God's name gives this guy any kind of power whatsoever? He is a nothing. I grew up 2 blocks from where he grew up. If I walked the other way, I was at the apartment where Mary and Fred Jr., her father, were at 179th Street on Midland Parkway. Everybody in Jamaica Estates hated that family. And yet, this guy comes up from nowhere and gets power over an entire party that used to be some really decent people in there. And I'm sure there still are. But how does this guy get away with this? Uh-oh, silence.
I think everybody has an answer, but
Yeah, I think everybody, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think part of it was definitely, part of it was definitely racial grievance, coming off of the first black president, which some people were very excited about, but some people were very not excited about, and were wondering, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my way of life? I think that's still playing out in a lot of the culture war kind of narratives that you saw in the midterms, and that will continue to proliferate probably going into 2024. That was something that certainly existed prior to the former president's ascendance, but it was something that he was able to tap into with great effect. Folks who were feeling disaffected, unseen, unheard in our democracy, injecting race into that was very powerful and very effective for a lot of those voters.
It was. I mean, I think there was more than, so let's keep in mind what happened. So we have someone who won one election.
Lost the popular vote.
Lost the popular vote. That's an important point. One election. Everything Errin said was true. There was also this fear, misogyny about over his opponent in that race.
Oh, yeah, we didn't get into that.
Yeah.
Right? And so that race was just something that was so unexpected to everyone, including Republicans, that once he got into office and other Republicans started replicating this thing, talking to these people who felt that they were unseen in a way that they liked and understood, and it became, this is not mine, and forgive me, I can't remember who said this, but I saw this on social media today. The Republican Party, for them, it's like Trump in 2016 was a drug, and they keep trying to get that high again, and every time it's less and less, and that's what we're seeing in subsequent elections, but there's nobody else who is in charge of that party. DeSantis is trying, but they don't have anybody else. So the idea was that they hitched their trailer to that wagon and are continuing to ride it. Now it's possible that it's being ridden into the ground now, and that maybe there's no trailer at all anymore and they don't know. But right now, that is the reason why Republicans all did. And it was, I think the whole fear thing was overplayed. Like, people didn't want Trump to tweet at them. who cares if Trump tweets at you? I think they saw they wanted power, and they thought that was the road to it, and so they were going to take it.
So 3 quick buckets. Bucket one is the Republican Party had been moving in this direction
Correct.
for a while.
Party
2 things
exists.
I'll cite. One is when President W. Bush's immigration reform bill got killed by his own party. That was a sign of where the party was going. The racial politics have been brewing in various ways, and as the cliche had it, the dog whistle became a bullhorn. But you saw that developing, and I think the Tea Party was a prototype of the Trump movement in many
harbinger.
ways, organizationally. Second, there was a kind of tragedy of the commons within the Republican Party in 2016, where everybody thought they could beat Trump. So they either wanted to be the last man standing against Trump or the person who get Trump's support against the other guy.
Yeah.
So no one really ganged up on him. No one went after him until it was too late, when he had already built this up. The third is he is a very talented demagogue. I mean, who was a celebrity, which I think we can't underplay, and who was very good at grasping grievances, not all of them racial or immigrant, some of them economic, and he just played this card very well and had a standing because he had been a businessman on television. And that the celebrity and a certain odd kind of skill cannot be underrated.
I agree with everything that everybody's said. I'll make one small point. I did a piece after 2016 that said Donald Trump is actually our first independent president. And by that, I said he had all the attributes of somebody who people have talked about as a potential person who could run as a third-party candidate and win. He had celebrity. He had an enormous amount of money. He had no particular ideology. His convictions ran in various directions, so he could do that. What Trump figured out was that's not enough to be a successful candidate for president. You have to hijack a party, and so he went into the Republican nomination battle and hijacked the party. If you come out of that as a victor, people begin to emulate it, and the people who didn't like him become more timid.
Yep.
Question.
Thanks very much, and welcome to everybody to the Kennedy Library. Some points that you made that maybe we could talk maybe a little bit more, I'm not real sure. But I had this discussion a while ago. I look at how our 2 major parties connect with voters, citizens, people, whatever label you want to put on them. My point in the conversation that I had previous was in 1968, the Democrats have had a much harder time talking to the American voter. Full of facts, figures, ideas, thoughts, wishes, hopes. Republicans more and more since '68, with the silent majority, the South, with Reagan, have learned they connect with the voter by screaming out grievances. And so with that sort of thing, I looked at your opening point about the divide we see now in the electorate, age-wise. I look at the 40 and lower group that's out there now. Maybe I'm mistaken this, but I see their last 2 elections, their turnout, as trying to put a brake on where the country is going, as much in a way saying, hang on, folks, is this really where you want to go? Let's think a little longer about this. And with their participation in the election, they've hopefully provided time for the country to really think that through. What do we want to be, a democracy or something else? And knowing the Democratic Party's difficulty in relating to their voters, how do you think they're even thinking about this huge block of new voters that we've gotten to come to the polls, and whether they stay active or not is a whole other issue. But how would the Democrats relate to that kind of an age group?
Great. And I'm going to, before somebody answers, we've got 2 more live people who, in the 5 minutes we have left, we're going to try to get in questions. So if somebody would like to, one person would like to take that, and then we'll go to the other 2 so we can get them in.
Could I, yeah, let me, I think that the way you put that was so wonderful, because what you were really saying is that the voters under 40 are the mature people in the electorate who want us to sit back and think hard before we throw away democracy. And in a lot of ways, that's what I think. I think that the, on the Democratic Party, Democrats, I think, tend to think they don't ever know how to do politics right. There's this guy Obama who is pretty good at politics. There's this guy Clinton who is pretty good at politics. And whether you were for or against any of these folks, they understood that. You know, there have been many moments when people talked about, here is the enduring Democratic majority that's coming. I think that the Democrats run a particularly diverse party. The Republican Party is significantly more, it's becoming a little less so actually, but it has been demographically more homogeneous. Mm-hmm. And that the Democrats are also of their nature a coalition of the center and the left. And that is holding that, they can't win a majority without the center and without the left. And that creates some tension, but you bet Democrats are thinking a lot about younger voters, because it is so obvious from the polling that if young people do not participate at higher rates, they're going to lose. Mm-hmm. And so I think the answer is yes, they are paying attention.
So nicely done. Sir?
Hey, good evening. My name is Vernon Myers, here for the Harvard Senior Executive Fellowship. Just a real quick question for Dan. I'm going back to Florida tomorrow. You made a statement about the Florida Democratic Party being a mess. What would be some of the things you'd provide as far as advice on how we can fix that mess in Florida?
They'll give you a $500,000 contract to be their consultant.
I don't know what the right answer to that is. You know, state parties depend on a variety of things. One is an infusion of money, but 2 is leadership. Yeah. People I know within the Democratic Party writ large point to, for example, the state party chair in Wisconsin, whose name is Ben Wickler. And even Republicans in Wisconsin give Ben Wickler a lot of credit for what he has been able to do, both to expand out beyond Wisconsin, an interest in Wisconsin, to get Democrats around the country to pay attention, to do organizing year-round, and they have some wonderful organizers in that state who've been at it for 1,000 years, Teresa Vilmain being the most significant. But it is a slow building process. There's no kind of magic formula for it. But it takes leadership, it takes commitment, it takes organizational skill, and it takes patience.
One sentence, I had a great student named Alexander Caffrey who did a lot of work in the Florida Democratic Party, now is working for Pete Buttigieg. She wrote a great chapter in a book edited by Theda Skocpol at Harvard that was about the problems of the Democratic Party in Florida. See if you can find that, because she did and she wrote a paper in my class that was a brilliant analysis of what was going wrong organizationally in the party. So Alex is the expert on this. Caffrey.
And I would just, one last thing I would add to that. I mean, look, your state to the north in Georgia, Democratic Party was not that great there, which is why Stacey Abrams started her own apparatus. And I mean, it took 10 years, but she built that thing.
Yes.
And you know, that was definitely party adjacent, if you know what I mean. It worked for Biden, Harris, Warnock, and Ossoff a couple of years ago, but didn't get her across the finish line this time.
But it may get Warnock over again.
Yeah. So our last brilliant question.
Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for speaking. I'm starting to be a journalist right now, so you guys are all huge
Thank you.
inspirations.
We're exhausted. Hurry up.
We're tired.
So I wanted to ask, Kimberly, you talked about the other swing voters, specifically young and people of color. What do you think made them show up this time as compared to previous elections?
I think it was exactly what EJ said. They're the adults in the room. I think they saw clearly what the stakes were, and we're like, wait a minute, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is the world that you're having. Look, listen, young people. I think about my stepchildren who were 20 and 22. They only know post 9/11 America.
Yep.
Right? They had never been through some sort of crisis. So certainly, I think, again, I don't think we've talked enough about the impact of January 6th. I think after that was galvanizing. It was clear to them, like, whoa, democracy is in peril.
Sure.
And then you add the lack of reproductive rights, and then you add all the other things that we're talking about too.
Growing up with gun violence.
I mean, yes,
Climate change
right.
looming.
They grew up having drills in their schools. I had tornado drills, which was terrifying enough. I could imagine having active shooter drills. So this is the only thing that they saw. So their vantage point was very different, and it gave them more clarity. I think older people are like, yeah, things ebb and flow, and they go up and down. That was not so for them. So I think that's probably the biggest reason.
And I would
I'm
also
so glad
say
you
too,
mentioned climate because I do think passing the climate
Yes,
bill
climate's
made a
huge.
difference in the sense of, well, maybe these guys are doing something, because there was, particularly on the progressive side of the young vote, a frustration. But this has been building for a while. 2016, I think, did something to make make participation greater in all groups. But there's been a rise both in 2016 and 2020 in the under 30, under 35 vote. So this is not, indeed, we don't even know yet if this election will be higher or lower than 2018, because it was pretty high in 2018, but this has been building.
what I would, and just to add to what Kimberly was talking about in terms of persuasion voters and what it takes to persuade somebody to actually vote versus them staying home, I think generationally that looks very different. I mean, especially for Black voters, we'll just take that for an example. I grew up in a generation where it was a generation after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? So for a lot of us in that generation, voting was definitely discussed in terms of a sense of duty, the people who had died for us to have the right to vote. We were obligated to get out and go to the polls. It just wasn't even a question, right? 3 days after my 18th birthday, my mom's taking me to the same precinct where I went to watch her vote growing up, right? This generation of voters, my niece, for example, who is in her late 20s, is not somebody who necessarily is persuaded by that message. What gets her to the polls is not even any particular candidate, it's about her power.
Yes.
It's about the power that she can be convinced that she has by getting out and casting her ballot. And so that is, I think, a message that is going to be particularly potent for young voters to see their agency in that process going forward is I think, the pitch that you're going to see, especially the Democratic Party and Democratic organizers that I talk to. They don't talk about specific candidates. They talk about the issues and how people can use their vote to express their power on those issues.
So can I just wrap it up by saying that everything that you all just said in answer to that last question reminds me of an interview I heard on the way to tonight's session, who was by the 25-year-old from Florida, whose name, right, who said exactly that. It wasn't just, how did you get me to vote? How did you get me to run? And he said when he went to a press conference from Governor DeSantis and started asking him what he was going to do about gun violence, the governor said, you don't matter. I don't have to answer your question. And he said, basically, I'm back here having won the election to say I matter and my questions do. So I want to just say in terms of mattering that the audience showing up tonight are wonderful organizers putting this together, but more importantly, the 4 journalists who are on the podium with me tonight are people who I've been reading, and the loving for a long time, and it is very seldom where you come and meet people in person and they exceed these incredibly high standards that you set for them. So I want to thank our panelists here tonight who were really wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. And thank all of you. You guys are awesome.
And you now get to go home and get some sleep. And that's the,
Ah, yes, sleep, my old friends.
What is that?
Yes.